We're so excited to have y'all here this morning, and we are here to renew hearts and minds. We're here to renew public spaces, private spaces, educational spaces in particular. And in case you missed that, that's why we're here. So we're glad that y'all are here to join us for a day of discussion, conversation, prayer. And it's my privilege now to introduce our keynote for the morning, addressing educational need in this unique moment of history and our culture here in the United States, and in particular here in the DFW area. He is the son of Mark and Diane, who are career missionaries in Brazil. He himself spent a good part of his youth in Brazil. And from that beginning, by God's grace, he has gone to do great things with his life. He earned a master's and a doctorate at Oxford University in theology and religion. He is an accomplished academician, entrepreneur, and minister of the gospel. He's dedicated his life to serving the Lord. He has a wonderful wife and 5 awesome, rambunctious children. Lives currently here in Arlington, Texas, but who knows where the Lord will take him in this life. But it has been my privilege to work alongside of him as a brother and co-laborer in Christ for the past 4 years. And I think y'all will enjoy what the Lord has put on his heart to share with us this morning. Dr. Nicholas Ellis.
Well, good morning. It's great to be here. I'm going to sound really chipper to kind of get you guys, get your blood flowing. This morning, I want to take 3 short sessions to address our current state of higher education, where we've come from, session number 2, and then session number 3 to present a way forward for community-governed higher education for the community of faith. I want to start looking with you at Nehemiah. If you have your Bibles, you can turn. I'm going to read some text here. But Nehemiah, for Aaron and I, as over these last several years, as we've thought about how to reshape the conversation around Christian formation, Nehemiah has become a key text for us. So starting in chapter 1, Nehemiah begins, "Now Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity about Jerusalem. They said to me, 'The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire.' When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days." Now, what's taking place here in Nehemiah? A previous generation had returned from captivity, and they'd rebuilt the temple. They'd reinitiated religious practice. The Jerusalem cult was starting to take place again. Services were happening in the temple. But what was not happening is that there was no civic self-governance in Jerusalem. So people had begun to worship, but there were no structures for civic or political self-governance, self-rule. And so Nehemiah heard that there were no walls. There was no way for Judah, the tribe of Judah, to take control of its own affairs. And the book of Nehemiah will begin to tell the story of how Judah began to reassert its self-governance as a people, as the people of God. Likewise, I think today, the problem with the church is one of self-governance, not in a political system. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about partisan politics. We're talking about something more fundamental, the governance of the formation of our children. So today I will ask this question that will guide the conversation for this morning in a keynote, and then later in our afternoon sessions in our workshops. Who governs the formation of the next generation? Is it the state? Is it the government? Is it university accreditors? Is it publishing houses? Who governs the formation of our children? And I will submit to you that first of all, it is the family within the community of faith that ultimately governs and is given the right and authority and responsibility to govern the formation of our children. So let's take a look at where we are now. And in fact, in Nehemiah, he shows up in Jerusalem, and the first thing that he has to do is he has to survey the damage, unfortunately. And so he comes, and Nehemiah 2:11, he came to Jerusalem, and he was there for 3 days. He says, I arose at the night, and I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal for me except the animal which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well, and onto the refuse gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were all consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, and there wasn't even a place for my mount to go by. It was so broken down. So I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again, and I returned. We are in a situation today where we have slowly but surely given over governance of education and formation, especially in wide-scale higher education in our country, and really across the world. Really, for the last 400 years, there's been this slow third-partying of the formation of our youth. We've been somehow convinced that after 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, definitely 12th grade, the timer goes ding. The oven's done. It's time to hand them off. It's not my responsibility anymore. Give them to somebody else. We don't really know who. We don't know faceless, nameless professors, but we're going to hand our best and our brightest off to someone to say, it's your turn. Go shape them and go form them. And really, it becomes a question of who is the next person that's going to influence for 3, 4, 5 years the formation of souls. Because that is what education is, after all. It's the formation of a soul. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity talks about how when you're forming a human, you're forming an eternal being. You're setting the trajectory of that person for the rest of eternity. Not just until they die. Because when we die, we are eternal people. But you are setting the trajectory of character, personality, formation for an eternal being. It's one of the greatest responsibilities we have. One of the greatest honors that we have as parents, and especially as educators, is to form and shape a soul. Not a city, not Jerusalem, an eternal soul. And who is responsible for the formation and shaping of that soul is the fundamental question that we're concerned with today. And so we can begin to see that slowly, insidiously, this question of who governs education, who governs the formation of our next generation, the answer began to be, well, not you. Surely not you. Surely not your church. Surely not your family. Surely it's someone else's responsibility. Let's find that person and give them to that institution, to that university. And indeed, here in Nehemiah, we can see that there is an active attempt to colonize and govern God's people. Nehemiah 2:9, that I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letter. Then when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard this, they were very displeased that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. The first thing that we will experience is as we begin to ask these questions and start to take back questions of governance, we can anticipate that we will experience great displeasure from numerous different parties. People who have exerted their will and their interests to govern the formation of the next generation. So Sanballat and Tobiah were displeased. Why were they displeased with Jerusalem beginning to rebuild and restructure its governing structure? Well, because they were feeding off the dependency and the subservience of the Jewish people. Eventually, later in the book, we'll find that Sanballat was actually using the storehouses of the temple for his personal business operations. Follow the money. Always follow the money. There's always somebody who has an interest. And so Tobias was using the storehouses, and he was saying, and when Nehemiah found out, he would say, you can't use these storehouses. These aren't yours. This isn't your property. And so the enemy of God's people want to govern them, leaving them dependent and commodified for their own benefit. Their first response is to mock. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked and despised us and said, "What is this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" We can anticipate that as we begin to ask questions about governance and about oversight and about ability or authority, the first thing that you'll hear will be mocking. Who are you? I heard this all the time in England. We were homeschooling several kids, which is a big no-no in England. And the first thing that I heard constantly was, what gives you the right to educate your children? I heard it all the time. I was finishing my doctorate at the University of Oxford at the time. I said, what gives me the right to teach my kids about Judaism and history and theology? What gives you the right? And then, because British people really don't dislike class questions, I would ask, what's the only difference between the Crown Prince with his tutor and my children? It's one of class. That shut the conversation down fairly quickly. But the first thing that you see is you see mocking. You see despising. You see subtle undermining of authority and right. That's not your right. Okay, you took back homeschooling. Fine. That's fine. Well, it wasn't fine 35 years ago. It wasn't fine. The same exact language that was used about those of us who wanted to take back K-12 is now being used against those of us who would question whether higher education should be in the Christian space or the secular space. And we begin to hear that, do religious universities, should they even have accreditation? Should you even get financial aid? Should they even be tax deductible? So we begin to see this undermining of the right of God's people to self-govern their own education. What was Nehemiah's response? Verse 20, so I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, he and his servants will arise and rebuild. But you, Sanballat, you have no portion, no right, and no memorial in Jerusalem. We are not yours. You have no right, no portion, and no memorial in Jerusalem. Nehemiah rejects their scorn as having no value and no weight, and he delegitimizes their right to govern and oversee the people of God. Why do we turn our children over to Caesar? Only to be surprised that they become Roman? Are we surprised? Why are we surprised? We hand our children over to Caesar and then are surprised when they become Roman. So there are a couple different ways that we see this colonization. The first is ideological and the second is financial. Let's talk about ideological colonization. Really, for the past 400 years, there's been a battle for the reframing of reality, of identity, of worldview. The university that was once a place for the exchange of ideas has now increasingly, and almost exclusively, for those of you who have been in university in the last several years, become hostile to the core ideas and worldview of the historic Christian community. There was a place in public education for a Christian worldview. In fact, we made the university as a place to explore ideas from within a Christian framework. And slowly but surely that worldview began to be excluded. Today, the public space is no longer a pluralistic space. It's now a sectarian space. But instead of being Christian sectarian, it's become secular sectarian. There is no neutral. Secularization is a religious worldview with its own creeds, mottos, catechism, and worldview. There is not a neutral posture in how one views the world. Secularization stands against the biblical ideas of family, of community, and of the Church of God as the chartered center of formation for the nurturing, sustenance, and faithfulness of families and community. You see, the biblical worldview proclaims that education is primarily the responsibility of the family within the community of faith. And though we may delegate these responsibilities at times to others, we do not lose and cannot abdicate the oversight of this formation. This, of course, stands in antithetical relationship with the secular ideology. And why is the modern university so hostile towards a religious worldview? This principle of non-neutrality must be understood, and we must embrace it, for the secular state has become increasingly hostile to these most essential services, namely the development of the moral, intellectual, and spiritual imagination and formation of the child. Because if they can undermine the imagination, if they can undermine worldview, if they can undermine the way delight and beauty has been shaped and formed in the heart, then they can control other simple things like actions and taxes and other such mundane things. So at its core, secular education has abandoned the pursuit of what is true. It's rejected the notion that there even is a God. It's twisted the beautiful into its own image. And how have we ever come to believe that such a system can educate properly the souls of our progeny? How does the Bible define what's good and just? Well, we only need to read Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. God is actively defining this world in terms of truth and beauty and justice. And yet these things have been undermined by a secular state. We have, by and large, I would submit to you, entered an intellectual dark age in which secular institutions and even many religious or even so-called Christian institutions have chosen to adopt a materialistic, secular, humanist worldview that is incompatible with the Christian view of reality, a view of God, man, and creation. Now, the university has the potential to be a source of great light. I am a university man. I've dedicated my life to education. I love the university. I love the formational spaces. Indeed, when illuminated by the light of God, the university can be one of the great institutions and structures of this world. Even the Oxford motto, Dominus illuminatio meo, the Lord is my light, unfortunately, increasingly, it becomes a source of darkness. Our contemporary worldview has stripped away the beauty, the myth, and the deeper magic that underlies all of creation, leaving only a materialistic whole on the outside. They worship, as Paul says, the creation and not the creator. They look at the shell of the egg and not the purpose and center of the egg. Indeed, our secular universities will mirror our cultural struggle, and now struggles to define such basic concepts as language, like what is male and female, what is marriage, how to define true justice, what is human, who is the self. These core ideas have been directed and guided and misled by those who would colonize our intellect. An intellectual and spiritual other way will be necessary if we are to return to the very soul of education, which is specifically the shaping of a soul into the likeness and image of our Creator, to know Him, to glorify Him, and to make Him known. Education is not data transfer. We become experts at transmitting knowledge, but with no mechanism to communicate or even define wisdom or virtue. So we have entire tech companies filled with brilliant people with tremendous amounts of knowledge and no wisdom. The second colonization is that of financial slavery. Debt. Financial aid, unfortunately, despite its best intentions, has been a driver of the greatest source of debt in the history of the world. Federal student aid accounts for most of the college tuition increases between 1987 and 1910, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's pretty simple. The more money that students can borrow, the more colleges are able to charge. It's pretty simple economics. Oh, you have more money. Well, we're going to charge you more. The average cost of attending a four-year college or university in the U.S. rose 497% between 1985 and 2017, more than 3 times the rate of inflation. Average student loan debt, $40,000. Average monthly student loan payment, $500. Average, we're not talking the extremes, this is average. Total student loan debt in this country, $1.75 trillion. The number of borrowers who owe $100,000 or more, 3 million people. 3 million people. Debt is financial enslavement. No less so because we are spending it on educational programming. It's still slavery. And this is due to the commercialization and commodification and the consumerism that has become higher education. So by and large, modern society has given over governance to unworthy stewards, rather than the community of faith and the student sitting at the center, surrounded and supported by institutions, government, publishers, Pearson, Elsevier. Now, we have put the vendors at the middle, surrounding them with consumers who are sucking off the teat until we've exhausted their resources, their financial resources, their intellectual resources. And we have to ask the question, what are we doing here after all? Now, we have some excellent allies in this fight. We have excellent Christian colleges in this country. It's really a miraculous thing, unheard of in the world, that you have so many different excellent Christian colleges. However, runaway cost, debt, Title IV overhead, restrictions increasingly limit their effectiveness. Most are isolated and under-leveraged. Dallas Baptist is a great school down the road. They have 5,000 students. In the meanwhile, there are 300,000 people enrolled in 3 community colleges in this metro area. 300,000 people enrolled in 3 community colleges in Dallas-Fort Worth. We're not doing enough. We don't have the structures and the instruments to do enough to change the tide of formation. We don't have a single Christian trade school in the state of Texas. I'm a humanities guy. I never thought about trade school. My whole family is a bunch of Mennonite farmers in Montana, but I never thought about trade school. I went classics, linguistics, religious studies, and never thought about trade until a man walked into my house to fix my HVAC and just began to exude Christ. And I asked him, where did you get education? Do you have a Christian education? He's like, I went to trade school, man. There's no Christian trade school. I have a great pastor up at Denton Bible Church. And it hit me, it struck me, that somehow, somewhere the church has abdicated the formation of the trades. Is there anything more Christian than a carpenter? And somehow we have said, not our responsibility. Welding? No. We'll teach you sociology. We'll teach you the classics. We'll teach you the greats. We'll teach you politics and philosophy and economics. But if you want to learn to be a really great HVAC guy, we don't really have a space for you. That HVAC guy engages and shares Christ with more people on a weekly basis than I share in a year. And we have no instrument to speak into his life. The modern Christian university network does not have the wherewithal in themselves, despite honorable intentions, to substantially impact the broader culture. They are not going to be our salvation. A radical rethinking of Christian higher education is going to be necessary if we are going to provide a realistic alternative to the secular educational state. However, we must realize and recognize that much of the ideology that underlines the modern secular university is designed for maximum ideological and financial bondage. And friends, the worst problem of all is that among Christians, we're facing exactly the same problems. The same debt, the same promiscuity in college, the same drug abuse, the same ideological loss. There's very little difference if you look at the statistics between Christian and secular universities in terms of the experience and the outcomes. Private Christian university has become a luxury, not a birthright. We've abandoned the trades. I've never heard of a Christian community college. And so the final point is, where do we go from here? What's our response? We can ride around the rubble, survey the walls, take a long, hard look at where the situation is currently. Are we going to do anything about it? And over the next 2 sessions, I'm going to present a vision for a renewed governance of the future of our children and our society, and how together we can rebuild solutions for long-term, no-debt flourishing.